Hello everyone and welcome to Live on Air this Sunday evening. I've got with me Stuart Mannins, and sitting next to Stuart, you can't see him, he's off screen, is Dr. Leo Hobbs, a retired nuclear physicist. Well, he's been retired for a few years anyway. And tonight we're going to look at a variety of issues. Our overall topic is finding your voice, theology that matters. Now, as the church goes through its stresses and strains, I mean by that the whole Christian church worldwide, but also within our little local fellowships here in Auckland, New Zealand, the question of are we actually finding a consistent Christian voice to communicate to the world with a theology that matters to the world, I think is becoming more and more of a live issue. So for this evening's broadcast, we've got 3 questions, and I'm just going to very quickly flip through the questions. The first will be about New Zealand church leaders speaking with authority on issues that count. The second will be on the evolution versus creationism debate. That's happening all over again in the Methodist Church newspaper called Touchstone here in New Zealand. And the third issue, if we've got time, that we want to look at tonight is here in the New Zealand Methodist scene, there's been a bit of a to-do about whether candidates for ministry have to be married in the eyes of the state before the church can accept them for ministry. So all of those things are about finding our voice, finding a theology that matters. So let's put the first question, and I'm going to ask this of Stuart to begin with. I've called it the sounds of silence, and what's worried me is that New Zealand church leaders hadn't spoken out about, for example, the current refugee crises in Europe and East Asia for some time, after these humanitarian disasters began to emerge. And I believe that in the last week, the Roman Catholics and the Anglicans spoke together with one voice, imploring the government to do something. And then latterly, the Presbyterian Church has done something. But to the best of my knowledge, we're not hearing any of the other churches coming through with us. I could be mistaken on that, but it doesn't seem to me that there's been any kind of coordinated Christian response. So without any further ado, Stuart, what do you make of this? Do you think church leaders need to speak out with authority on these issues?
I think church leaders should speak out on issues that count. So my response is a definite yes. I don't think leaders can lead if they don't influence their followers. They may prove to be wrong, but they can't be silent if they're going to remain leaders. So I should think in the 2 particular issues, we in New Zealand should offer to take more refugees on the grounds that it's never wrong to offer help.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. Leo, have you got any comment about that? From your perspective, should we be seeing our leaders speak out on these issues?
Excuse me. I've no doubt whatever that the answer is yes. It really is astonishing how little lead is being given at the moment by the current government, waiting for something or other to be investigated or some advice from somewhere or other. I would have thought that at the present time it would be completely appropriate to make a commitment in principle and let the details then be worked through.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you that what's needed is the call to action to be followed, and then some of the administrative details can be worked out later on. But it's as if Mr. Key has got the government into such a position that they've got to work out, cross the T's and dot the I's before they actually take the call to action. And it seems to me that this is totally about face. Stuart, have you got any comment on, say, why do you think some churches aren't responding in the media to this particular issue?
Can I suggest that Leo be invited to say what he was just about to start to say?
Oh, sorry, I didn't realise that. Yeah, go ahead, Leo.
I'm just trying to think. Yes, we had a recent example where the government decided, well, it's not very recent now, of course, but they decided that they would send a military force into Iraq to advise the national military there on what they could do to counterinsurgency, and they were going to be in a training role. But you remember there was an announcement made, and a long time went past before the details of the logistics were worked out. So, you know, they can do these things.
Yeah, they certainly can. Just an aside, I've noticed that we've got 4 viewers that have come in, and you can ask questions. You need to, let me just stop sharing my screen for a moment. And if you sort of look up towards the top of your screen, I'm not sure whether it will be on my left or your left, one of the 2 corners, you'll be able to toggle on a Q&A pod. You look for a little matrix of 9 dots and try toggling that on, and that then should give you the option of typing in a question. And as questions get typed in, we will attempt to answer them. So let's just come back now to our actual question sheet. I'll just share that again. For those that have just come in, another viewer's just come in, we're talking about finding our voice so that theology matters to people. And at present, there's a deafening silence in governmental terms about the current refugee crisis in Europe. But what's worrying me a lot more than the refugee crisis in Europe, Stuart, it's the crisis in East Asia. And this is our corner of the globe. There's a humanitarian crisis that's emerged, refugees fleeing in various situations. Have you got any comment on that?
No, other than to say, like I said before, it's never wrong to help people who have a problem and ask for help.
So the question is, how many could we possibly take? Can we take, let's say, could New Zealand take 10,000 refugees for resettlement?
Well, I don't. As long as we start somewhere, it's like the widow's mite. It doesn't matter how much you've got, you give because there's a need there.
Yeah, but you see, my point here is that the refugee crisis in Europe might be better dealt with by the countries in Europe, whilst we got on immediately and dealt with the refugee crisis that's emerged in East Asia. In other words, there does have to be some prioritizing. There's got to be some thought given to both a quota of refugees and where in the world we're taking them from. Now, I don't believe it should be an either or situation. It can be a this and that situation. But what's happening is that if the government is in fact dealing with any of this, it's doing so without any reference back to the New Zealand public, without any reference back to the opposition parties. And so it would seem to me, in general terms, that the church ought to have spoken up much more quickly than it has. And I'm aware that the back 20, 30 years ago, we had a much greater voice as churches throughout New Zealand united around the resettlement of refugees. Leo, can you recall back in the days when you were in the Baptist Church at Long Bay? That church was responsible, I think, for resettling a number of refugee families. Does that strike a chord in your memory?
I'm sorry, no, I can't recall that. I don't know exactly when that would have been.
I think I'd been talking with Stuart and I had been talking with Angus MacLeod about it, who was the then National Secretary of the National Council of Churches. Yeah, and it may not have been Long Bay Baptist. I think it was Long Bay Baptist, had a number of such families. Certainly the North Coast Methodist Church took in a number of Vietnamese refugees. Stuart, I think Takapuna Takapuna Methodist took in refugees, and I'm fairly sure when you were choir master at St. George's Presbyterian, they were settling refugee families. Does that strike a chord with you at all?
Can't remember at St. George's in the 70s, but it might have been. But at any rate, with what you've been saying, there's nothing I would disagree with, apart from doing nothing. We ought to prioritise. We ought to go about things sensibly. We ought to look at our corner of the Pacific, if that's closer to us and it makes more sense. All those things ought to be done. The one thing we shouldn't do is stand by and do nothing, and that's what we seem to be doing now.
Right. And out of this arises a germ of a question for me, Stuart. Maybe the churches aren't speaking out on this issue because they've learned not to speak out on hardly any issues. So 30 years ago, the church had a voice in the community. It was listened to by the media. It may not have been respected, but it was listened to. But in the year 2015, in New Zealand society at least, it's very rare for the church to be listened to in any aspect. Is that your experience, both Leo and Stuart? Do you, when you read the newspapers or watch the television or do the internet news, do you see the New Zealand churches taking an active role in society?
No, I don't, if I can answer first. And I've just put it down to lack of courage, quite frankly, perhaps being discouraged by what's been perceived as politically expediency. But I think it's a lack of courage. This is what if we care about justice and fairness and peace, this is what we ought to be talking about. Maybe there are some Christian communities that have such a separate distinction between spiritual so-called issues and ordinary everyday issues.
Secular things.
Yeah. I've selected a question from, I've selected a question from Susan David that's just come through, and she says, according to CNN, residents in Germany and Iceland are taking in refugees. Maybe we should do this as a church. And I think that's a pretty fair comment from Susan, that maybe the Methodist Church needs to organise itself in the next week and say, hey, if the government would accept so many refugees, we will undertake part of the refugee resettlement, be it 10 families or 20 families spread throughout New Zealand. Any questions you'd like to, any comments you'd like to make on Susan's question? Germany and Iceland are taking in refugees. Should we publicly declare that we would do so as a church?
I think we should all do what we can. I noticed tonight in the news that the Syrians in New Zealand say if the government will allow them to come in, they will undertake to look after them, their own people.
Yeah. Any comment from you on that, Leo?
Well, I'd like to come back to something you mentioned earlier about the church speaking out. I wonder, has there been a sort of tendency for a feeling of that the church doesn't, or the leaders of the church don't express views that have not already been tossed around in their annual assemblies or whatever they might like to call them, and a position agreed, which everybody can agree to, and then the moderator or whatever, he feels empowered to speak, but he's possibly had his fingers burnt in some way sometime. He's not prepared to speak from his own conviction unless that's already been cleared in some way.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point, Leo. The Presbyterian Assembly, that meets every 18 months or 2 years, or has it reverted back to an annual gathering? I'm not sure, but certainly the Methodist Conference meets once every year at present. The Anglican General Synod every 3 years, and so on and so forth. So in a very real sense, all of these churches are using archaic structures and communications. The idea that you could determine a national policy and it would be what was the agreed position for the next 12 to 24 months, it doesn't make any sense in today's day and age where events move with frightening rapidity. The ability of church leaders to not respond could be in some measure, or I should say the disability for them not to respond could be in some measure due to the fact that they don't use modern methods of communication. While the rest of the world has a cell phone at its fingertips and can be informed of events virtually instantaneously, the idea that church leaders would go away and spend, check out their policies from 2, 5, 10 years ago, etc., simply doesn't make sense to me. The church has to adapt to the modern methods, or it ceases to have a voice that matters. It ceases to have a theology that matters. I've just clicked off that I've done answering Susan's question, so I just come back and advertise. So if you hover your mouse around up the top of the screen, you should find a little matrix of 9 dots, so you can toggle on Q&A if you're a viewer, and type in your question, and when we select that question to answer, it timestamps it in the video that's being recorded, and you can go straight to the question if you want to find out what the panel thought in terms of answering. Sorry, Leo or Stuart, you had a point that you wanted to make.
Yeah.
I'm just going to comment that in relation to the question of the church having a voice, the newspapers going and asking opinions and so on. Nowadays, I think you see more of these sorts of comments with a moral basis appearing in the columns that various people contribute to the paper from time to time. Usually once a week or something like that, you'll find a piece by, if I may mention a name, Peter Calder, for example, and there are others, and they seem to be taking the kind of approach to making a comment illuminated by compassion, for example, which is a pretty good guide, I think, to so many of the issues that face us.
Oh, I think that's an excellent point, Leo, that you've got columnists like Peter Calder, regularly in the New Zealand Herald, but of course they appear, their thoughts also appear online, and so they're not necessarily limited to a once a week comment. So the bloggers can become a kind of voice of conscience. So I think it's an excellent point. Okay, well, we've looked at that. Let's have a look at another issue that's just come up in the last month or so in the Methodist Church newspaper, Touchstone. There have been 10 or 11 letters around evolution versus creationism. And what's worrying me here, particularly I'm thinking of Leo in this, what's not being said in the debate, Leo, and why it matters that it's not being said, is that there's just a total misapprehension of what science is about, and there's also a total misapprehension, Stuart, of what the Bible is all about. So you've got yet again an evolution creationism debate going on where the two parties, or the two sides rather, seem to be talking so utterly past one another without even a modicum of understanding of either the science or the biblical theology. Now, I'm going to put it to Stuart first of all. How do you read the story of Adam and Eve, Stuart? Do you read it as literal fact?
No, never. I don't think it was written as literal fact. It came from an oral tradition, and anyone who's looked at epics and the nature of epic stories knows that this is not history. It may be embedded in history somewhere. There may have been a great flood all over all the world, but it's not historical. The message of the particular story is always in a metaphor. It's pointing to something else. And to read the Bible in any other way is to lead to a dangerous end result for me.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a really good, powerful statement of what the Bible is not. It is not an actual history of the dawn of creation. The Bible is a product of people's hearts and imaginations about their mythological origins.
Right.
But Stuart, Leo, I wanted to particularly ask you about this. Many people also take a kind of literal approach to science. Now, you've been a physicist all your working life and then 20, 30 years beyond in retirement. Does physics proceed out of a series of metaphors in exactly the same way that the Bible proceeds out of a series of metaphors? Is there such a thing as a scientific fact that stands forever?
No, certainly not. Science works because certain sorts of people are curious about things that they can observe in the natural world. And they begin to imagine why it should be like this. And they say, well, let's see if we make certain assumptions as to why a tree grows better in this sort of soil than it does in that sort of soil. Let's see if we can check out those assumptions and see what conclusions we might draw from them. And then if that seems to accord with the facts, let's see what predictions we can make about other things which are related to this in this area. And if the predictions turn out to correspond to what you can observe, then you say, well, that theory seems to be pretty good. I'll hold on to that for the time being, but I've always got to keep an open mind. And if anything comes along to question any of the predictions of the theory, then I have to go back to square one and start the whole process again. Now that's how science has built up its understanding. We have to realize that science is just a way of talking about the world that we can observe.
How very helpful that is, Leo. Science is a kind of a way of looking at the world and interpreting it. In fact, the meaning of the word science goes back, it's out of the Latin scientia, which simply meant knowledge. And as far as I'm aware in the scientific community, it doesn't matter what discipline, biology, physics, whatever, knowledge has always expanded. People have always thought that they could add to the store of knowledge. Is that correct?
Sorry, could you just say that again? I was thinking about something else.
That people have always thought that they could add, the scientific community has always thought that it could add to the store of knowledge. In other words, it's not fixed, it's not static.
That's right, yeah. Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. So when we see this debate in Touchstone, I mean, I've been part and parcel of this debate the whole of my working life, but it doesn't do my heart any good to see it keep emerging when in fact the whole of the creation science, if you like, is so nebulous as to well, I'll rephrase that. It's not that it's so nebulous, it's rather that they want it to be so literal, but it's actually nebulous at its heart. That they're not adding to the store of knowledge. They're simply looking at knowledge and trying to rearrange the facts, as it were, to suit their own methodology. In other words, they don't proceed out of a scientific point of view, which is saying, okay, I've got a theory about this. I've got a hypothesis that I want to test. How do I accumulate the evidence to see whether it stacks up? And of course, when you proceed in that way, evolution becomes pretty well an unanswerable way of describing how life on Earth has evolved over time. Whereas creationism always comes back to, no matter how you look at it, they're going to say the Earth started 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, or whatever particular figure they want to put on it. They want to make a special act of creation, and they will try to manipulate the facts. They will try to exclude some facts that somehow build up that particular case. So the whole problem, as I see it, with the evolution creationism debate is that the two sides do continue to talk past one another. Stuart, I think ultimately the church has to bear some responsibility in this, because it hasn't, over a couple of centuries, been honest about how we understand the Old Testament and the New Testament. Any comments on that?
Oh, yes, I think that's tremendously important. I think one of the biggest difficulties in the last 50 years from the message of the church, particularly in the movement that I was brought up in, has been this view of seeing things as absolute. A Christian had absolute truth. God never changed. But these things are not true. Our views of God have changed. Our experience of God keeps changing. Change is at the basis of all evolution. Once you start locking things in as the only way to do something and the only truth, and being truth to eternal life, you lock off your mind from anything creative.
Yeah, I really feel that there is no longer any creativity in this debate, evolution versus creationism. And the church, the Methodist Church particularly, needs to take a stand on it. Most people, probably the viewers that are watching this, are unaware that if you went back in New Zealand church history, you would find that this has been debated since the 1880s. And there have been some marvelous instances of church leaders before we got to the 20th century saying, look, as a church, we need to totally reevaluate our understandings of the nature of myth and legend and so on and so forth. So this is something that I will get a little bit more active in the Six Senses forums. I've allowed the evolution debate, creation debate to go by relatively uncommented on, but I'm going to start to put out some of the stuff that I've done in the past on this, and we hope to have revitalized Adam and Eve and Evolution book ready in the next few months for people to begin to look at. So that's something that I am working on, and as well, an old church leader now, I'm still active in doing that. So that's that topic. Are there any final closing comments on that topic before we move to the final topic that either of you would like to make? Stuart or Leo?
I'd just like to add something on the issue of the biblical account of the creation story. It may be worth observing that all the ancient cultures had their own creation myth, and you know, something which made sense to them in terms of the environment in which they lived, and the one which we see in the Bible is a particular one of those creation myths.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the whole variety of creation myths. Okay, any final comment from you on it, Stuart?
No, that's good.
Thank you. So we move on to our final issue this evening as we try to find a voice and a theology that matters. We come from, I think, one of the great humanitarian crises in the world, the refugee crisis that's been going on for decades now, huge numbers of displaced people moving around the world. And we focus on the little New Zealand Methodist Church. Yes, it's debating a big issue with science and religion in Touchstone, but by and large, the church seems to have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to determine whether candidates for ministry have to be legally married. Now, this to me is completely extraordinary. What do you make, before we actually get round to discussing the issue, what do you make of it? I just think it's unbelievably trivial.
Do you want, shall I respond to that?
Yeah, sure.
I agree. It seems to me if you really understood what Jesus was on about with his parables and so on, it was, we're not here to obey the details of the law, but to find its spirit, and particularly the spirit of the new kingdom, as Jesus was on about. So I'm not so concerned about has the Methodist Church, but others appropriately are. I would ask, has the Christian Church the moral right? And I ask myself, did Jesus have any moral restrictions on those he asked to minister in his name? And it seemed to me that Jesus didn't. He took anybody who wanted to do those things that brought about justice and peace and freedom and the cessation of poverty. No matter who you are, you can be my disciple and minister to me in this.
That's a pretty good summation, Stuart. Jesus used the outcasts. He used the tax collectors. He used the prostitutes. He also used the morally upright citizens as well. in trying to bring about this new order, this new kingdom. The idea that as a church we could say, oh, here's potentially an excellent person to take the gospel forward into all sorts of situations, but do you know, the state hasn't legally married them. This is, to me, absolutely morally reprehensible. A lot of people, I think, don't really understand the nature of sacrament in the church, and I think this comes back to a sacramental issue. In the first couple of centuries of the church's development, it was mainly, if you like, the Western Church, the Roman Catholic Church, that started to develop the idea of 7 sacraments. And marriage was included in those sacraments. But this development is going on totally within terms of the church's understanding of what a marriage was, not the state's understanding of what a marriage was. Because, of course, the state at that stage, before the time of Constantine, was occasionally persecuting the church. It wasn't necessarily welcoming the Christianity as it spread. So the real issue was, did the church consider a couple to be spiritually married? Not did the church check that they were legally married? And so that's the ancient part of the church debate. But if you go back to what you're proposing, Stuart, which is the time of Jesus, and who did he get to do his ministry? And when you put the two of those together, it is just a nonsense for the church to say to an otherwise ideally suitable candidate, no, we can't have you doing Methodist ministry because you're not married. Now, the particular case in point, I don't want to mention the names, but I've spoken on numerous times. We've debated this in Sixth Census 2 or 3 years ago. And as far as I'm concerned, the person concerned had all the right qualities to candidate as a presbyter. Their spouse was not interested in the Christian church, but had come to a point where she had said, well, okay, you go ahead and candidate. It doesn't, I'll let you do your thing, you let me do my thing. And of course, they'd been together for such a long time, raised a brilliant, happy family, etc., etc. And so in all of this, what we see happening is a background set of decisions that don't actually impinge on the reality of a person offering for a valid ministry in and through Jesus Christ. Now, if I was the spouse of that particular person, I would certainly regard my human rights as having been denied by the church, because it shouldn't make one iota of difference whether I'm married or not in terms of my de facto husband candidating for ministry. Am I making myself quite clear here? I don't think the church has taken anything but an immoral position on this particular issue. Any comments on that, Stuart or Leo?
Well, I just agree with that, David.
I'm quite astonished that it should be an issue. I had no idea that it was. I mean, are you really saying that only married people could be church ministers? Is that what you're saying?
Either that or single celibate people.
Yeah.
I think some people believe that.
Yeah, oh yeah, certainly some people believe it, but I can't see that there's any ethical or moral basis for having arrived at that decision. Whilst we've been talking, Susan's posted up 2 more questions, and I'm going to select one that she's asked on this. It is, the church seems to be allowing the general public to determine what the values are. As Stuart rightly says, those who are for laws of justice and peace should be welcomed or included. I'm just going to select that, Susan, and we will deal with your other question a little bit later on. So Susan's comment is, it's really the criteria for doing ministry is peace, justice, and implicitly in what Stuart said, or explicitly in what Stuart said, laws of compassion. Any comments, Stuart?
No, that's understanding what I'm saying. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. It's a very neat little summation, Susan. Thank you for that question. I'll just click that off as done, and I'm just going to I think Leo's astonishment is probably as widespread as most people. How can the church say that it has a voice that matters when it deals for a number of years with an issue like this, but doesn't come out in terms of saying anything about the East Asian refugee crisis, which has been happening around us for a decade? It's just unbelievable bad prioritizing. So I will draw that part to a close. We've got 4 minutes to go. We get to the 45 minutes and we'll close down for the evening. Susan has brought back a question about science. And she says, science is based on testable theories. It's always open to new trials and studies. It should be so in our lives. What I've found in talking to those with differing views is once they say, I believe, there's no room for discussion. Now, I think I understand what Susan's getting at there. It's when you say, I believe this, there's a kind of a dogmatism creeps in. And that's the dogmatism that in today's day and age, with today's learning, I think we all need to avoid, whether we're in the scientific community, whether we're in the Christian community, whether we're gay, lesbian, whether we're refugee, etc. There are no dogmatic answers that actually stack up. What we need in the world today is a modicum of modesty about our beliefs, that our beliefs are important to us, but they're not necessarily determinant on other people. And I think that just to draw it to a close, I'll get a brief comment from both Leo and Stuart. There's now a famous case in the United States of a county clerk who's been sent to jail for 7 days because she tells her staff they're not to sign marriage licenses for gay couples seeking the little bit of state confirmation. Any comments about that case?
No, but I'll make a general comment. I prefer the word trust to belief for the possibility of misconstruction. And it comes from the old creed, credo, I believe, and if you didn't believe this, you're a heretic. Now, that I think misses the essential thing that started off with belief, that was you trust in something. We always have to trust in something, but it doesn't mean that we believe we've arrived.
Good point. Stuart, I'll just bring myself up and highlight. I'd like you and Leo just to swap seats now. So if you don't mind doing that, and then we can just see what Leo actually looks like, or our viewers can. While that's happening, there are 5 viewers in, and probably if it's anything like the previous ones, it will go up to between 40 and I think Cinema Addicts got a little bit of promotion going on our Christian movies as a form of communication, and that's got up to about 500 views. But anyway, I just come off there now, and there we go. Leo, I'd like to wave and say hello to the audience.
Hello, everybody.
Very good of you to come along. in a couple of weeks' time, we've got or next week, we've got a really, I think, key discussion from 3 different church groups at Waihaki, at Riverton Union Parish, and Upper Hutt Uniting Parish. And each of those is going to be talking about an aspect of children's ministry or particular things that they're doing with kids, ideas that are really worth sharing. And then the week after that, in a fortnight's time, we've got the Reverend Dr. George Armstrong, the fiery old Anglican activist who organised the Peace Squadron, was instrumental in Springbok protests, Bastion Point, things like that, really put the Anglican Church on the map. We were going to have Peter Matheson. He unfortunately has a prior engagement and sent an apology, but he sent a set of issues for us that I'll be posting out from that particular event. I'm inviting in Simon Williams, who's a maths teacher at Onehunga High School and also a candidate for ministry, and he'll be able to give a good balance. Simon is from South Africa, and as someone who was oppressed under the apartheid regime, I think he will have a particular contribution to make to that debate, and Jim Pearson and Stuart and myself. So it's quite a panel coming in a fortnight's time. So I want to say thank you very much for those that have watched, Susan for asking the questions, that's great, and Leo for coming along, and we will set you up so that you also can watch online if you want. It goes live and gets recorded and sent out. So I'll say good night at this point, and thank you all very much indeed, and we'll look forward to seeing you perhaps next week.